Also, we'll
Yes.
drop into the chat a link to the project page, which has some documentation and other resources. But we'll get going. So yeah, this is about the Drupal API client. So we'll talk about what that project is, why it matters for Drupal, the kind of life of the project thus far. And then also, I know there are folks in the Backdrop community at this conference as well. So we'll take a little bit of a Backdrop specific detour as well when we're talking about some of the ways that this project can be extended. So should be a good time. That is me doing some very real surfing. As was mentioned, I work at Chapter 3, and before that, Pantheon, and earlier than that, other places in the Drupal agency world. Have done a lot of front-end work, and lately have been doing a lot of decoupled Drupal work, and just looking at the various ways we can kind of push and extend Drupal's front-end development. I live in the Chicago suburbs. I also love Nintendo and Nintendo-related things. The game I'm playing the most right now is an RPG called Sea of Stars, which is really fun. And I also started playing, not quite a Nintendo thing, but video games. I started playing Fallout 4 again after watching the Fallout TV series, if anybody's been checking that out. And then, yeah, as mentioned, I'm at Chapter 3. I have been there for not too long, maybe 1 or 2 months at this point, but excited to get going, and also looking forward to contributing to the Next for Drupal project at Chapter 3 as well. And also want to take a second to thank Pantheon, who I worked for previously, and they supported time on this project as well. And then, yeah, just a fun little side note. So the slides that we're looking at right now, including all of the between page transitions, this is actually just a Drupal site. So these are all Drupal nodes, and it's using a module that I maintain called View Transitions that uses the new View Transitions API and can do some pretty fun transitions between pages. But what we're going to talk about today is the Drupal API client. So what it actually is a set of JavaScript packages to help you source data from common Drupal APIs, including Drupal's JSON API endpoints. Another goal that we have that is not an official thing, but something that we're proposing, is that these packages eventually be offered under the Drupal namespace on NPM. Excuse me. I gotta skip one here. Okay, here we go. So yeah, also this was a project that was submitted to the Pitch-burgh Innovation Competition that you may have heard of. It took place at last DrupalCon, and there were funds raised to sponsor community submitted projects, and we were lucky enough to be selected for funding, specifically $10,000. But also it was a good acknowledgement that people were interested in this work. But it also now presents the fact that this is a $10,000 question of why Drupal would need an API client and a project like this. So I think there are a handful of reasons, personally. One of them is, I think, shown by looking for similar projects on NPM. So if you were a JavaScript developer, for example, who found out that you're going to be working with a Drupal backend, I think it's completely reasonable that you might search on NPM to find tools and resources that you might be able to use. And this screenshot is probably a little outdated at this point, but the results are still pretty similar. So if you search for Drupal on NPM, you get kind of a wide-ranging and potentially confusing set of packages. The first one, that's called Drupal, is an implementation of parts of Drupal's user and access control API. And then there's a Next.js Drupal web form package that is, very specific. Eventually you see something that's a Drupal SDK, but it's unclear if that is an official Drupal thing or not. If you know to look for the Drupal organization, there are only 4 pretty specific packages that are published under the Drupal namespace. And then in comparison, if you were to search for WordPress, this set of results makes a little bit more sense to me, and kind of makes it, at least implies more that the WordPress and the WordPress community is serious about JavaScript. So the very first result is a client for working with WordPress. And then there are a lot of packages under the WordPress organization as well. A lot of that, I think, is driven by the Gutenberg editor, because a lot of that is written in React. But still, these are, even some of those utilities are things that you could use outside of the context of Gutenberg. And then this isn't, a completely fair comparison, searching for Contentful, since it's a completely headless CMS. But I do think a developer who has worked with Contentful as a backend, might have similar expectations if they're working with Drupal, where here you see, there's a client for Contentful and a bunch of really specific packages for interacting with Contentful. So yeah, the fact that, there's a bit of a confusing story there and not a lot that is officially provided as part of the Drupal project, I think, colors the view of Drupal for outsiders. Another reason why I think that we need a project like this is that there has been a past history of a lot of people solving or trying to solve this problem. There's a bunch of somewhat similarly named SDKs, a project Drupal State that I've maintained in the past. The Next.js for Drupal project also has its own built-in client. So, this implies that there's a need for a tool like this. But, in the past, there have been, projects with different maintainers, different needs, things like that. They all are pretty similar in their baseline functionality, and even in some cases, their overall APIs. We don't have to get too deep into this code sample, but this is the Drupal State project that I mentioned. And here you create an instance of the store, and then you can use a method like getObject here and provide the object that you're retrieving, in this case, node recipe. And that's going to get all of the recipes from Drupal's JSON API. Or you can request a particular recipe by ID. And then this is the Next for Drupal client, which is pretty similar in its API. You create an instance of the client, and then you can use get resource collection or get an individual resource. So, a lot of the baseline functionality is similar, but the projects serve slightly different needs and priorities. Some of them are framework specific. For example, that Next.js for Drupal client. It has assumptions baked in about Next.js and React, which definitely makes sense for that project, but it's not something that you could easily pull out and use with a different framework like Vue, if you're using that as a front end. And they also have different sets of maintainers, and it is not necessarily like a Drupal core associated project. So it could be possible that all the people who have tried to solve this problem before are wrong, but obviously, I don't think so, and I think there's value in having a tool like this. So going back to Pitch-burgh, what we initially proposed and committed to were a few high-level things. So first, what we were calling a vertical slice proof of concept. So not all of the functionality for our 1.0 release, but a very specific slice of it that kind of goes across much of the functionality for the library, so that we could get early feedback and also scaffold a lot of things for future development. We also wanted to put together a proposal for the Drupal JavaScript maintainers around the idea of promoting this to the Drupal namespace on NPM, and then having a full 1.0 release of our JSON API client. So diving in a little bit to kind of the early concepts here, and how we wanted to approach this design. One thing that is potentially a little bit different from some of the other clients that I've worked with in the past is that, thinking of this as, something that ideally could be a more official Drupal client, we wanted to make sure that it's something that could support different API types and be extended in the future. So as part of this, we built using a base class, and that API client base class basically has all the things that might be in common between these different APIs. And then they can be extended for each specific implementation. So for example, we extend that API client class for the JSON API client. So this is actually, we can take a quick look at our earliest demo, essentially. So here in the browser, you see there are two different example clients. One is the JSON API client, which gets a JSON result from JSON API, and another that uses a Drupal GraphQL endpoint instead. If we take like a high-level look at the code here, this is just a proof of concept, so it's pretty basic, but we have our base API client class, and that has a few properties that are defined, like the base URL and an API prefix. For example, GraphQL uses GraphQL, and JSON API uses JSON API as their default prefixes. So we set those values in the constructor, and then the one other method that we added here on the class is fetch function. So by default, this uses default JavaScript fetch to get data from the API endpoint. But it's also possible to provide a custom fetch compatible function if you want to. So, if you wanted to manipulate headers in a specific way or use a specific fetch package, you could do so. So that gives us this baseline, and we have, this fetch utility for sourcing data from the API that any clients that extend this, any packages that extend this don't have to worry about. So if we look at the JSON API client class that extends the API client, it sets a different API prefix, as we mentioned before, and then it implements this get collection method, which gets a collection of resources from JSON API, and it essentially, you pass in the type. So in this case, you'd pass in something like node -- article, and it takes that and it determines the endpoint that it needs to fetch from here, and then uses that fetch function to get the response and return that. For GraphQL, it's instead implements a query method. So for that, it has to use a post request, but it still uses that core fetch method. And also you provide a query for the shape of the response that you want back from GraphQL. So if we look here, the end result, we have those two clients that share quite a bit, but have those different methods. So we're requesting get collection on the JSON API client and query for GraphQL. All right. So yeah, that is a look at that early demo, but that general concept of having that base API client class that gets extended is definitely something that we kept focusing on as we continued developing this project. So, some other things that you get out of that is, it's possible to extend quickly so that you can layer on just the things that are specific to the type of API that you're talking to. If you have certain, opinions about what you want your library to do, whether it's a particular approach to caching, or like we mentioned, a particular library for fetch. You could extend to create a package that just uses those opinions. One thing that we didn't get into that we have implemented is we've also added common authentication methods for Drupal. So you could use this package and extend it just to make use of those authentication methods. Or it might be something that you would package up in a front-end starter as well. So for the vertical slice proof of concept, at this point, it's been a number of months since that was completed and released. But we focused on getting a collection of resources for a specific type, like we saw in that previous example. So get all pages, get all articles. And that gave us a really good baseline, both for future implementation, but also getting feedback from the community. And since then, relatively recently, we have released our 1.0 release as well. And in fact, had a follow-on patch release also. So this is something you can install on NPM today and is out there for people to use. And we're definitely looking for feedback. So we can dive in a little bit through some of our documentation to see some more specific examples of what it can do so far. Double checking to make sure that there weren't any questions in the chat. But yeah, let's dive in and look at some of our documentation to see some more examples of what this can do. So these are our docs that are actually hosted on GitLab pages as part of our Drupal.org project. And these docs in and of themselves are actually an example of a front-end project that is using the client. So some of the code examples that we see are live code examples, and this is using the Astro framework to build these docs. So we have a quick start and like a more detailed tutorial that we'll go through some of the basics of. But so there's a couple ways that you can install the project. So you can use the package manager of your choice, npm or pnpm, to install it into your front-end project. Or alternatively, you can use a CDN import as well if you import the script as a module. So you can use it right off of a CDN. And the JSON API client obviously requires that the JSON API module be enabled. And it also can take advantage of the decoupled router module if you have that enabled. So it'll allow you to, based on a path, resolve a particular resource on the Drupal side rather than using a ID. So jumping into some of the, an overview of some of the things that are in this JSON API tutorial, we'll just look at a few examples. So really common task here. So this is working with the Umami demo data. Let's imagine that we wanted to get a set of recipes from Drupal and display them on our site. So here, we need to import the package, and then we create an instance of the client and provide our base URL. And then we can use the get collection method here with the node -- recipe to get all of our recipes. And then in the markup here, so these are Astro templates. So basically, this first section is JavaScript, and then the second section here is just markup. Just all co-located in a single file. So we iterate through the recipes and spit out just a row for each result here. Obviously, that's not super exciting. So we can look at layering on some styling here. So we just add a style block to use CSS grid. And we also add that class and a key when we iterate through things. So now we have our recipes in a grid displaying here. Obviously, we're going to want to display more information in these cards. So there's more, and actually one thing I didn't show that's probably useful is the shape of the data itself that we get back. So from JSON API here, we get an array of objects called data here. And for each one of those, there is the data for the recipe. So under attributes, we've got things like the body field and the title and the path to the content and things like that. So that hopefully makes a little bit more sense of this. Okay, so if we wanted to add a couple of fields, in the map function here, we have the individual recipe. So if we wanted to display the difficulty field, which is, I believe, actually, I think that's not a taxonomy. That is just a text field. So we can say recipe.attributes.field difficulty. And we also have the path alias that we're using for our link. So now we're displaying the difficulty and a link to the recipe. So the next thing that we might want to put here is an image in these cards. If we look at the result that we get back from JSON API, we'll see that there isn't a field for the image, but the image is included under relationships with JSON API. So you have to provide a query string to JSON API to get all of the data for that entity relationship. So there's a couple of ways that this package will make that easier for you too. So you can either provide in an options object a query string that just gets passed through to JSON API. So here it says we want to include field media image. Additionally, there is a package called JSON API params that you can use that really just provides some helper functions to assemble JSON API compatible query strings for you. So you could instead say, add include, add filter, and so on, and then just spit out the necessary query string that you need. So looking at the result here, if we look in the included array here, we'll see that there are media images, but the media images themselves also have relationships. So that is actually where you're going to get the particular file where you can get the data for the image. And that is still just the ID. So we actually need to essentially chain together a couple of these includes here. So if we do field media image thumbnail, that will actually give us all of the included data, including the files that we need in our response. So with that, if we go back down to our example here and use this query string with the includes, we can, when we map through the data, there is some code that we have to do here to kind of stitch together those relationships. So based on the reference, get the right image and then file so that we can use the image URL in the grid here. And then the end result is we see our images from Drupal included in the grid. So this particular example still, has you jumping through a decent amount of hoops to be able to get those entity references. So there's another feature that the library provides to simplify that a little bit. You can use a package to serialize or deserialize the data that comes back from JSON API. So for example, if we use this JSON package to deserialize our data, the end result is that things are a lot flatter. And all of those relationships are kind of at the top level rather than requiring you to kind of follow through that tree of references. So if we look at, where are we here? Field media image, you'll see that right on this, we actually have the image And then we have the thumbnail and all the other image types there. So it's a lot easier to get at the individual image URLs for the grid. And then just to cover a few other things at a high level, rather than talking through all of the documentation, there are options for handling translated content. So you can pass in a locale. So you can have like a default locale of ES, and you'll get Spanish content. But you can also override that on individual requests, like we see here. So that if you wanted to use Spanish as a default, but get the English version of a node, you can do that. We also have some methods for authentication. So right now we support basic authentication, simple OAuth, and also custom authentication headers. But again, in that options object, you can provide your credentials here for basic authentication. Or if you're using OAuth, you can provide a client ID and client secret. And the client will handle all of that negotiation for you. So it'll provide the necessary headers when making requests back to Drupal. And in the case of OAuth, it will handle getting the token, storing that token for further requests, and getting a new token when it becomes invalid. So that's just another kind of chunk of code that you don't have to write custom. That hopefully will be interfacing with Drupal in a standard way. We also have the ability to provide a cache. So by default, the client will make an API call to Drupal every time. But instead, if you want to use a cache, and we provide a default cache within one of our utility packages, in that case, the client will make the first request to the API, but then for subsequent requests, it'll check the cache first. And if the data exists in the cache, it will just serve that directly from the cache, avoiding redundant requests to Drupal over the wire. And then just a couple of other things worth checking out if you're interested in using these packages. We also have examples of using this in a variety of different frameworks. So we took great care to make things framework agnostic. So you can use it in React or Vue or Svelte. You can even use it in Drupal itself or within meta frameworks like Next.js. So each of them, the core functionality of the client is the same, but each of these frameworks have their own, little quirks. So we're trying to create a kind of a living collection of examples to hopefully get you up and running quickly. And then there also is a full API reference in the docs here that is generated through our type-doc comments in the code base. All right. So yeah, that's, excited about the docs, but hopefully that provides a good overview of what the client can do. There are a few other configuration options to mention that aren't yet fully documented. So we did talk about providing your own fetch method. So that's another thing that you can provide in the options object. And here's a quick example where you provide a fetch method here that is actually just setting headers with the requests. So I've used that in the past to do things like provide hash keys from Drupal so that we can know on the front end when content from the Drupal backend has changed. But there's a variety of other reasons that you might want to use a different method for fetch, even just having a preferred library. There's also some tools around logging. So you can provide a debug option, which is going to give more verbose output when using the client. And then also you can provide your own logging library if you either had like a particular style of output or wanted to log somewhere other than the console. And then we won't go too deep into it, but JSON API also supports modifying data on the Drupal side. So all other CRUD operations, So we also support those methods as well. So you can, we have helpers that allow you to create new content in the CMS, update, delete, and things like that. Here's a quick example of what that looks like. So we have this create resource method. We're providing the type again, node page. And here we're just providing a data object for the things that we want to provide when creating our resource. So it'll have a title and a really simple body value. There we go, slides. So let's see. Another thing that we could spend a little time looking at is, so I mentioned that we might take a slight detour into Backdrop. And one of the things that I talked about before that is, I think, important to the way we've been approaching this is really trying to make this extendable. So as potentially like new ways to expose data within Drupal fall in and out of favor, we're hoping that this is still going to provide a baseline to be able to talk to those APIs. But one thing that's interesting thinking about a project like Backdrop, which obviously has its roots in Drupal, but is still providing a different set of headless APIs. You could still even use this client and extend it to talk to Backdrop's APIs as well. So I put together just a quick little example so we could see what that looks like. Let's see here. Yeah. So this actually was my first time installing Backdrop myself, which was fun. But Backdrop has a headless module, which allows you to enable endpoints for different content types, different views, things like that. So here I installed the module and enabled the page content type and the administer content view. So I have those two endpoints that I can talk to. All right, and then in code here, I did have to take one shortcut. So because I'm not as familiar with the ins and outs of Backdrop, one problem that I ran into is that I didn't know how to configure cores for cross-origin resource sharing within Backdrop. So I'll try to figure out what the trick is for that, or if there needs to be enhancements to Backdrop to support that. But that means that I wasn't able to run this API outside of Backdrop because the cores requests were being blocked. So I basically just loaded a JavaScript within the Backdrop site itself. Since that's on the same domain, it gets around those cores issues. But so I just have this script here that is actually loaded on the Backdrop site. And so we're loading the API client from a CDN. And then I am creating a new JavaScript class that extends the API client. So the first thing that needs to be different about the Backdrop headless module is that it has a different kind of root of the API. So I'm using the V2 API endpoints here. We could instead use the V1 if we wanted to, but for V2, the kind of root of all the API endpoints is API/V2. So one change we made here is that in our constructor for the class, we're just setting a different default API prefix. It can still be overridden. You could change that to use the V1 endpoint, for example. But we're just using API V2 as the default. And then similar to what we saw before with the concept of having a different method that we need to use for JSON API versus a different method that we needed to use to get data with GraphQL. It's a similar concept here. So what I want to be able to do is first get this admin content view to get a list of all of the pages that are on my Backdrop site. So that has this structure of views, node underscore admin underscore content, and then a display ID. So here we're creating a getView method, which takes the view ID and the display ID. So those are things that are variable. So the first thing that we do is we determine what the endpoint needs to be. So we're taking the base URL that is set when we create the client, the API prefix from up here. There's always the static views argument, and then the ID of the view and the display ID from the view. So if we actually jump ahead to where we're actually calling this in code, this is what that actually looks like. So it's get view, node admin content, and the display is page. So going back up here, we construct the endpoint, and then at this point, we basically just need to call the fetch method that is on the base API client class. So it looks like this. So we're getting the response and the error out of the object that comes back. We just pass in the endpoint to fetch, and there's a little bit of error handling. And if there's not an error, what we're returning is the response as JSON. And then if we wanted to be able to get an individual node for this content type endpoint, pretty similar idea. So created a get content type method, and what we're passing in here is the type and the ID. Similar idea with constructing the endpoint. So the node argument is static, but then we need the type and then the ID. And we use that same fetch method in the same way and also return the JSON. So then I have this main function that loads on the site, on the homepage in this case. And all we're doing is creating a new instance of that headless client class that we created up above. And then I have a couple of example requests. And then I'm basically just taking the response and spitting out the JSON formatted on the page. So the first one, we're going to get the result of that view. So this is what it looks like. Yeah. So I basically just created a div here that it gets spit out into. So I'll reload here. And yeah, this is the results from that view. And the most important thing that we get here, we get the node title, but we also get like the node ID so that we could reference it at that other endpoint if we need to. And this is all of the results for that content view, which is the exact same view that is used under content here. And then if instead we wanted to just spit out and see the results of that one individual piece of content, so it's a page with ID 7, we can just change the variable here that we're displaying on the page. So we'll display that single result. And then when we reload, it'll make the call to the endpoint. At least it should. Maybe I need to clear my cache at this point. We'll do that for good luck. Not sure why that's not changing, but that is the single results client. Yeah. Not sure, but I'm sure you get the basic idea between those two kind of extended methods. So one last refresh. Still not happening. So live demo fail, but hopefully it still gets the idea across, and some more of the ways that the client can be extended, and also how helpful having that kind of underlying base class can be. So we have just a few more minutes, a few other things to cover quickly. And since we only have a few more minutes and I want to at least leave a little time for questions, I might skip over a few of these. But hopefully some of the stuff that we talked about demonstrates why we thought it was worthwhile to build our own library rather than using an off-the-shelf solution. It allowed us to build in some things that are specific to Drupal that I think would have been harder to do otherwise. And also, this was the only approach that we could find that we could really think of that could make it extendable in the same way. And also, we have fewer dependencies as a result. I won't go through all of this, but along the way, we made some decisions on developer tooling and did some, what I think are some cool things along the way, including using GitLab CI and GitLab pages in some interesting ways for Drupal.org JavaScript projects. And going back to the funding, now that we've completed our scope of work, it allowed us to establish an open collective. We have paid some of our contributors, but probably the biggest thing is that just having this funding and the Pitch-burgh competition in general has just brought a lot of additional visibility to the project, which has been invaluable. And we also have some funds left over for things like maintenance, or if we needed to do hosting, for example, API endpoints and things like that in the future. And I definitely don't have time to go into this. Certainly you can follow up if you're curious, but having the funds for an open source project like this also did have its own set of challenges, like working with the open collective, tax issues, things like that. It could be personally a lack of experience, dealing with funding for open source projects from my perspective, but definitely pluses and minuses to the funding. And we really see this as a starting point, even though we have reached our 1.0. But we have an issue in the ideas queue about publishing this under the Drupal namespace. So if you see value in that, would love a +1 or any feedback you have there. There's a lot of opportunity for the documentation to continue to evolve. But one of the biggest things that we want to do is just hear how people are using this or would like to use this project. And I think the more that we can evolve to meet more community use cases out of the box, the more useful this project will be. And I think the more likely it will be that it will live on. And another thing that we want to focus on after 1.0 is TypeScript improvements. So the project does use TypeScript, but I think there's a lot that we can do to have a better set of types and also kind of automatically generate types based on schemas from Drupal. So yeah, any feedback is greatly appreciated, but my hope is that people start using it and share how they're using it, and it can continue to evolve from there. But if not, at least we had some fun along the way. And thanks to everybody who contributed, either early on or in development, and special hat tip to our new maintainers that we gained along the way, Kobe and Pratik. And yeah, we have our project page. We have an API client channel on Drupal Slack, have bi-weekly meetings. I left this line in from a previous version of this talk. But yeah, we have a bunch of issues in the issue queue. If anybody's going to be at DrupalCon, I'll be there for the contribution days as well. Would love to talk or work together. And yeah, I think I'm like right up on time, but if there is any questions, would love to answer them if we have the time for it.